morning, good afternoon to everyone who's tuned in to the day 3 of the SDG Cities Global Conference. We are starting off with our first session entitled Digital Transformation, Accelerating SDG Impact on Cities. I am Michelle Tan from Global CEO Alliance. I will be moderating the session today, and I would like to thank UN Habitat, DIFID and the team for allowing us to have this session with all our esteemed panelists today. The digital revolution connected and changed the way we lived in an unprecedented way, further saddled by the pandemic, as so we heard from the previous discussion yesterday coming from the cities and also the private sector and other civil society networks. The physical economy has been forced to shift into a digital economy, but not everyone has the capacity to be in that journey. So we organized today's session to look on how digital transformation is shaping cities and accelerating the SDGs. And we'd like to hear from our esteemed panelists today on their experience, challenges, and how digital transformation can be leveraged into local planning, one that advances the SDGs. So to set the scene, I'd like to call on DIFID, Aubrey, to give us a bit of an overview about SDG cities. Over to you, DIFID. DIFID, I think you're on mute.
Sorry for that. I'm just trying to share my screen. I hope you'll get that there quite soon. Do you have it?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let me try again. Okay. Okay, I think it's probably up by now. So yeah, what we've been talking about over the last few days is the SDG Cities global initiative, and it really tries to support cities worldwide to advance the achievement of SDGs and to become economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable by 2030. And because there's so much to do between now and 2030, and because cities have such a potential to drive the achievement of sustainable development, particularly since more than half the world's population live in cities, more than 65% of the SDGs are related to cities, and because urbanization is still expanded very rapidly, we've seen that it's so important to ensure that that cities are on the front line of achieving the SDGs. And as we'll be hearing in this session, the idea of digitization and digital tools is going to be key for reaching the scale we want. And we really want to achieve change for more than 1,000 cities and 1 billion lives. And so we have a big ambition here. And what we need to do is connect the dots between data, having a good sort of baseline assessment on the city's performance against key SDGs, and then to have that evidence base to inform a strategic planning process. And we heard on the opening from the head of Cities Alliance that a city stands or falls based on the sorry for the background noise. It stands and falls on the success of the entire city, not just parts of the city. So the strategic planning process, as we'll be hearing from Carly soon, needs to be thoroughly inclusive, and it needs to have some goal setting for 2030. So we're not just talking about short political cycles, but it needs to have a vision for 2030. And then we look at another track then, which is looking at institutional capacities, because it's key that cities have those key capacities on governance, planning, municipal finance, as we'll be hearing later from Lenny, and effective service delivery in order to be able to deliver on the SDGs. So that diagnosing those capacities and building those capacities are going to be key. And then finally, cities need to be able to invest in impact. So projects that really deliver impact against those plans need to be identified, and they need to be prioritized for finance. And yesterday we had a big session on how to finance the impacts that we need in urban areas, and how to bring together like an ecosystem of finance in order to drive that impact. And we are also looking to link this with what's already happening. Many cities are doing their voluntary local review. So we want to build on that sort of political commitment towards the SDGs, but we're more than just review process, drive ambition and drive achievement. And digitization is key on each of these steps. So, you know, if we nowadays digital data, as we'll probably hear from Katja, is becoming so important, but also using digital tools to be able to get data, and even perception in perception data and spatial data, as well as statistical data and big data. So digitization is key there. Also in the strategic planning processes or city development strategies, but also, as we'll be hearing later from Global CEO Alliance, they're building for us at the moment a set of diagnostic tools, so we can actually diagnose how cities are doing in terms of governance, in terms of planning, in terms of service delivery, a kind of a self-assessment. And as many cities are doing those diagnostics, we'll be able to group cities together on common learning trajectories and link them to webinars, link them to training, and have them share their successes, and link them also to cities that are advancing well in the areas that they're learning. And finally, the investment track, as we heard yesterday, also has a digital element. It has a digital portal where cities can upload information about their pipeline projects, and that information becomes available to investors. I think yesterday, James Donovan, the head of the CEO of ADIC, but also the CEO of Global CEO Alliance, put it very simply, that technology is out there. It's a huge enabler, and we need to sort of embrace technology to reach scale. And that's a really important message. But the other important message is that with so many tools out there, data tools and digital tools, it's very important that, and so many keen corporations keen to promote these tools, it's very important, as we'll be hearing from Carly, that decision-making is still at the level of the city, and that in our quest to become smarter cities, we don't lose that essence of putting people first. And as Katja will be promoting, we're advancing with the idea of people-centered smart cities, not smart cities for the sake of smart cities, but people-centered smart cities, putting people first, challenge-driven innovation, demand-driven rather than supply-driven. And we'll be hearing further from Katja on that. So that's just a quick overview of how we see the digital world and technology really helping to advance the SDG Cities program. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Daifed. And we've heard so far the relevance of data and technology in local government planning and monitoring progress towards the achievement of the SDGs. And now I'd like to hand over the floor to Dr. Carly Pennick, Governance Planning and PPP Specialist in Capacity Building of Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies, to give us an overview on how data and technology can be integrated into local planning. The floor is yours, Dr. Carly.
Thank you very much, Michelle and David, you led right into a lot of things I wanted to talk about, so thanks very much. Yes, I'm going to be talking about integrating data and technology into local planning, and my name is Carly Pennick. I come from the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies, which is part of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. We've been working for 60 years plus on building the institutional and individual capacities of urban professionals, so we're an urban institution, and focusing in our mission on urban poverty and the quality of life in cities. So I wanted to start somewhere. I thought it might be a good idea, and I'm going to start with some statements and assumptions. Yeah. Now, what David was talking about is that we need good data. yeah, to be able to plan in cities and to make evidence-based decisions. Now, in addition, again, good, effective, strategic planning is important to the achievement of the SDGs and to achieving impact. And as Michelle was mentioning before, the digital revolution is really here. And as also has been mentioned as evidence in the trend to the desire to be smart. Yeah. So technology provides us with an incredible opportunity, but also with some challenges in terms of what we were trying to do. And when we integrate so what I want to focus on is when and how to integrate data into city planning using technology as a functional tool. So what are the key issues and possible lessons? Now, what I want to do here is show you a model. It's a model of a process that went with a toolkit that we developed for Cities Alliance a number of years ago, which we called City Development Strategies 2.0, 4 phases and a series of sub-phases, a cyclical process. Now, when you see this, the 2.0 is actually referring to that Cities Alliance asked us to look at a tested process and see where things were going wrong and how we can improve it. And so this is, let's say, the process as we designed it to try to improve on some of the issues. Now, when you look at this, there are a couple of basic parameters to this thing. Once it is people-centered, and it is extremely participatory, so that's very important. It focuses on data for evidence-based decision-making, and it definitely uses tools for analysis and decision-making. Now, I think also what Dev was saying was it is extremely local. And in that particular respect, it focuses on local issues, local stakeholders, and local stakeholders driving this process. Now, if you look at the different phases, so the sub-phases, I'm going to start with the 4 sub-phases are where are we now? Where are we going to go, which is where are we going is phase number 2. Phase number 3 is how are we going to get there? And number 4 is how to implement and to know we are on track. And if you look at very important cross-cutting issues are gender, poverty, and resilience. Now, when you look at the sub-phase of this, one of the first one, and understanding that this first phase is really about preparing and knowing where we are now. Now, the first sub-phase I want to look at, where data is important, is the municipal institutional assessment, where we do assessment of policies and programs and legislation, but in institutions and their resources. Now, this is in preparation for a process, understanding where capacity issues are and developing a governance structure that makes sense for preparing for the rest. Now, then you have building a participatory strategy, which is you need data on stakeholders. How are you going to set up this process of participation to make sure that everybody's involved in the whole process in a fundamental way? Then going to the baseline, the situation analysis, often called a profile as well, obviously looking at the characteristics and trends in the natural, physical, economic, environmental, institutional, social, cultural conditions of a city, very important, and where we are now and the trends that we see. Now, when you look at this is a very important input to the SWOT analysis, to the visioning, and setting of strategic objectives. And I want to talk a little bit about the strategic objectives because, and the visioning, these are moments when you really set objectives, goals and objectives that are measurable, and then that localization of SDGs becomes very important because you need to understand how, when you're going to achieve those objectives, those are going to link into higher level objectives. Now, also very important for data is when you're developing strategic options. Strategic options are broad stroke programs. You're prioritizing those. You need to understand what kind of people you have and what kind of resources. And that's also true in strategic action planning when you get down to the project level. And then you really start to look at multi-sectoral investment planning and how you're going to implement. Now, finally, also monitoring and evaluation. all the things you have been doing before are in fact linking into monitoring progress and knowing where you are in the implementation process. I want to mention two more things, and that is that we have two other major things here, and that is, in fact, a very specific moment when you look at how to strengthen data and information management. And that is a moment where you say, okay, we've collected all this data, but how do we going to link that into technology? How are we going to maintain this over a longer period? And this links into institutional strategies again, understanding who's going to collect this data? How is it going to be collected? Where is it? Do we know where it is? And how can we maintain it over a longer period of time? Now, this occurs also in this other period here, where if you're going to look at programming and projects, you need to look at institutions, their resources, and their capacities. Now, all along this, even starting in the municipal institutional assessment, is really understanding where capacities are and how those have to be developed. Now, we also did another similar thing in the Integrated Urban Planning Guide for Myanmar, which is Cities and Infrastructure for Growth, and linking very much into spatial planning processes. You see a similar kind of process, but in this particular case, understanding where data is in terms of more spatial aspects of planning. We're looking very much here at a strategic process, but we also really need to look at spatial aspects and linking that strategic process into spatial planning processes. So if you look on the left-hand side, you see that you still have your profile, your situation analysis, your baseline, whatever you choose to call it. But then you also have a lot of spatial data that you need for looking at scenarios. And then you have to think also about what kind of technology can you look for building those scenarios? What do you have at your disposal? And also in terms of what in Myanmar is called the conceptual plan. Now also in this one, obviously we have the monitoring in stage number 4. Okay, I want to go back to UN Habitats, what they've just introduced you or spoke about. And this is also a very, very special process, which has got similarities, but there are some things that I very much like about it. The data track, of course, is really, really fundamental in this particular process. And also for the same reasons, for getting a really good baseline, to be able to work against that when you're setting objectives, knowing what your baseline is relative to what you achieve, and as it links into the SDGs. And that's the action planning track. What is very special also about this is this enablement track, which is, or I saw on the last sheet, I think it was called institutional capacity building track. In any case, it had a slightly different name. But this is really focusing on, if you want to really collect data, have the right kind for making informed decisions and linking that into technology, then you need to have the right people in the right place at the right time. This process all along in the investment track, just as in the last one, is really need to know about how you formulate projects and how you resource things and how you manage those resources in implementation. Now, of course, they've been using the City Prosperity Index, and I know developing the urban monitoring framework for the voluntary local reviews is something that's really they've been working on in terms of the data track. Before I go to the key takeaways, I want to talk just a minute about something, and that is that let me just enlarge this a minute. We've had some experience with the implementation of these models, obviously, these processes. And I was involved in a discussion on India in terms of its smart city approach, and understanding that one of the difficulties they had when digitizing things was the absorption of the requirements of dealing with technology. So you can introduce these things into local government, but you have to be very, very aware of the fact that if they do not have capacity, it's impossible to absorb. Yeah. So you have to think very, very carefully about that. In addition, there was the institutional structure there didn't really support it. They have special purpose vehicles. They're dealing with smart city projects, and on the other hand, they have also another institutional, a parallel structure, which is dealing with other government functions. So there's a bit of a coordination issue. Now, there's also a problem with interoperability of technology. So how do you make use of this data that you need for decision making? Now, the other thing is that in much of these trends, sometimes we wonder whether the use of technology and the digital divide we're talking about, who is that benefiting? Is that benefiting a certain groups of people in cities? And is it inclusive, in fact? Do we have to watch out for, making sure that things are inclusive? The other thing, and before I go to the takeaways, is that I think COVID taught us a lot. And that is that in all the things as a capacity building institution that we were trying to do, we had to go online. And then you see the stark reality of the digital divide. And then you wonder a little bit about how, let's say, priorities are given to investments at the national level of a country in terms of perhaps trying to reduce that digital divide. And then impact is greater because you can reach more people. Yeah. So the last sheet, I just want to do a quickie summary here. This planning that we're talking about is a local process. So localization of SDGs is essential. Yeah, city planning in this particular perspective is driven by context and local issues. And there are really a lot of challenges introducing data and technology into institutions. In fact, the absorption capacity, the readiness, as we call it, the preparedness is sometimes limited. It really requires thinking about how institutions, organizations really work. And this actually implies, in parallel to this planning process, investment in organizational change. Yeah, so it's not only about data and technology, but it's also about having really smart people and smart governance processes that are essential in the strategic and iterative and spatial planning process. So to conclude, capacity and capacity development is really a must. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carly, for your presentation. And I'd like to underscore also that how you put it together, how technology can be an enabler, but the subject matter expertise at all level and in all steps, in all level is required, and how we can effectively share that capacity and knowledge to scale what we're trying to achieve here. Thank you so much, Dr. Carly. Now we move on to the next presenter, Mr. Andy Deacon, Managing Director for the Global Covenant of Mayors, to discuss a bit on the drivers, pressure in state of sustainable urbanization. Andy, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome, distinguished guest fellow panelists. Thank you very much for this opportunity to just say a few words about some of the work of the Global Covenant of Mayors that's relevant to this, and say a little bit about some of the recent work in the research and innovation space relevant to this question of digitization in cities and its role in supporting the SDGs. So just to start, sharing here findings from effectively a keyword scan of several hundred city climate action plans, some work in conjunction with the Connected Cities Lab at the University of Melbourne, and really showing a taxonomy of city emergency responses and some insights from the coming together of both cities on the forefront of climate change and dealing with recovery from COVID-19. And you'll see those grouped together under a number of different headings across governance, research and knowledge, infrastructure and technology, and economic decision making. And under each, a key series of themes that emerged from that keyword search and scanning of cities' published action plans. And under the infrastructure and technology piece, the third pillar that you see there, digital and IT came through very strongly, both in terms of digitization of local government services, but also in terms of things like upgrading of public transport apps to provide improved information for citizens and to encourage a move to public transport. You'll notice also under research and knowledge, then an important theme coming through around data gathering, and where cities have been gathering information relevant not only to addressing the climate crisis, but also to the impacts of and recovery from COVID-19 as well. And on the left-hand side, just to draw on the previous presentation, then some of those important pillars around governance, whether that's strategy, around stakeholder engagement, and in particular on multi-level coordination. And later on during COP26, on the 9th of November, we'll be launching some additional new research on the concept of regional and local contributions towards parties' NDCs, and the role of multi-level governance in recognizing that city action can support and help drive national ambition and trying to link together there. And that activity obviously would support multiple SDGs around clean energy and around climate action. So really a framework that's starting to emerge that brings together those twin tracks of both trying to deliver on climate ambition and climate targets and addressing recovery from COVID-19. And as was mentioned in the introduction to this session, the economic side of things and funding and finance also feature, and separate work under the Global Covenant of Mayors Invest for Cities programme on both looking at enabling frameworks, technical assistance to bring projects forward, about which I'll say a little bit more in a moment, and about opening up new sources of funding and finance and making new funds available. So that framework starting to emerge and some good understanding from cities' published action plans. But we recognize that all cities are on a journey and completed some work towards the end of last year to integrate a city climate action journey into resource planning on the Global Covenant of Mayors website, for which I'll share the address at the end of the presentation. And really all the way through from making a commitment on climate action to making a pledge to join the Global Alliance of the Global Covenant of Mayors, to then assessing risks and impacts through implementation, monitoring and review and validation, then data and tools, and the role of digital information will play a key role. And we're trying to support that by bringing additional resources into the resource library on our website, but also by delivering outreach through our series of regional and national covenants spanning the globe, really, and providing technical assistance, capacity building, and support for cities, not just to report on what they're doing, but really to try to move individual projects from citywide climate action planning to implementation and delivery on the ground. And you'll see there, really, this looks like a kind of snakes and ladders board, but is meant to be circular. And with that update of climate actions and an adaptation strategy, really a city can loop back around to, again, reassessing impacts and risks within their own context and the impacts of individual actions and measures taken. And that's the loop that we're trying to close through GCOM, and with the support of many partner networks and agencies, including joint work with UN Habitat, in particular focused on some of our work on research and innovation to support city climate action, but really trying to use digital information and tools to drive that activity and to understand the impact and whether we're on track to deliver against ambitious climate targets. And during the course of last year, we also worked with the World Resources Institute and Bloomberg Associates to conduct a number of one-to-one interviews to release a fairly widespread questionnaire and bring together a steering group of experts from across the globe, both on the social sciences side as well as the climate information and data side of things, into a steering group that then produced a white paper that was published earlier this year on the role of tools and data in driving forward climate action. The URL, sorry, it's a rather long one, is at the bottom of the slide there, but we can make this information available afterwards. But a number of key insights that emerge from that. One is really that mayors are continuing to raise their climate ambition in spite of COVID-19. And again, we produce annually an aggregation report of commitments and action through the now more than 11,000 cities that have made a commitment to the Global Covenant, and we'll be releasing the results of that assessment also during COP26 on the 9th of November. But what we're hearing loud and clear is that cities are struggling to implement those action plans at scale. And finance, access to data, technical capacity, and stakeholder buy-in were identified as the top barriers from that series of surveys, questionnaires, interviews, and the findings from our expert group. And the role of tools and data in supporting that climate action progress is important, but that is not the only thing that will result in project implementation by any means. And one of the findings that emerged was that many of the available tools lack sustained support, whether that's version updating, responding or updating in response to changing city needs and requirements, or just the fact that some of them exist as Excel spreadsheets that are going out of date after a few years. And many of them are hard for many cities to use. So arising from the findings of this work, we now have some ongoing work underway to try to bring together an ecosystem of tools to more readily and easily populate emissions inventories, for example, to link those inventories automatically to reporting platforms, to bring in new sources of data and information. For example, we're working in partnership in some areas of the world with Google and bringing in data and information from their Environmental Insights Explorer tool, but looking to integrate other sources of data and information at citywide scale to be able to more readily and rapidly populate emissions inventories, help cities identify priority actions and locations for those actions, and then support the development of business cases and business models, new approaches, whether that's revenue generation, land value capture, looking at other innovative financing models, crowdsourcing for decentralized renewable energy, to then be able to implement those projects. So the box here on the right-hand side has identified some actions to then try to better integrate an ecosystem of support for those cities who might be earlier in their climate action journey or are smaller than some of the mega cities with large climate or sustainability teams, but still looking to be ambitious and drive climate action. And you'll see there a number of key steps, whether that's standardizing support and data flows, whether that's bringing in complementary data sets on, for example, transport movements, traffic activity at citywide scale, or the potential for different types of renewable energies, and being able to integrate those quickly to fill any gaps in information and understanding. We do want to try to simplify and lower barriers to use, just to make it easier for cities to both access some of the tools to support the kinds of decisions that they may be trying to take, and to make it easier to move from one step of the journey to the next. And really, this is key. Tools and data that are capable of transforming into outcomes and action recommendations. So again, not just reporting, for reporting's sake, but really driving towards implementation. And then, yeah, that's the final point there. So should really be able to address everything from feasibility to assessment of impacts to the ability to integrate an understanding of financing. And it's really about that move from the planning phase of activity through to implementation. So a fantastically broad series of inputs to that piece of work, a very wide group of stakeholders engaged in that. And we're now really looking to drive forward and to build on this in the coming years to then be able to integrate tools and data much more readily to assist cities through that journey. Just one further example, have some pilot work underway at the moment with the World Resources Institute, which is looking at a climate adaptation and tools, data and information to support risk assessment and adaptation decision making, and looking to provide an exposure index to identify amenity hotspots. So for example, transport nodes, power generation infrastructure, and public health installations within cities, to be able to map those spatially at city scale, and then effectively overlay a very high resolution understanding of the spatial distribution of hazards, and looking to link that together to then be able to look at the spatial distribution of exposure as it directly relates to those amenities within individual urban areas. Pilot work underway in 5 cities in very different parts of the globe at the moment. We'll be saying a little bit more about that also during the course of COP, but then looking to publish further work and to look to develop this tool for many, many more cities during the course of next year. I'll start to draw things to a close. Just to say, I mentioned partnership with UN Habitat. Just recently, just over a week ago, ran the Innovate for Cities conference jointly with UN Habitat and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Over 7,000 registrants came together to draw on the previous global research and action agenda on climate that came out of the Edmonton Summit in 2018, but really an opportunity across multiple sessions to address a whole set of issues. When it comes to some of these cross-cutting issues and agenda, and the need for kind of new insight and understanding, then some kind of very strong messages that came through around the ability to use cities as test beds of innovation, and that really cities are the well springs of innovation, and are willing to experiment and to bring people together. And really, it's not just about the use of digital tools and information, but they can also open up new mechanisms for engagement and broader citizen participation in decision making when it comes to anything from facing the climate challenge to COVID recovery, and new mechanisms, services and support that are being brought into place there. So to conclude, it really is a journey. Not all cities are equal in size, geography, starting point, capacity, capability, but we do firmly believe that the use of data and digital tools and knowledge can help rapidly advance climate action by bringing that basic understanding together in the easiest way possible, and rapidly moving to priority action identification and also supporting implementation. As the Global Covenant, we're looking to provide the digital infrastructure and the ecosystem of tools and services to rapidly support that, looking to continue to grow our alliance, to deepen support with cities that have made a commitment already to the Global Covenant, but importantly, also to accelerate action in this crucial decade ahead. Look forward to unpacking much more of this during COP26. But thank you again to UN Habitat and to Global CEO Alliance, Michelle and colleagues for the opportunity to speak today. And I hope that's provided some useful food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. And thank you. And it's really inspiring to see how local governments are committing to climate action and how technology is helping advance and implement those ambition. Because for climate change, there's often physical and transition risk associated with that. And sometimes those are not
Right.
readily, it's not very obvious, but it has the most catastrophic impact on population and infrastructure. And we're happy to see that the commitments and the implementations are moving forward. Now, we would like to call on our next presenter, Ms. Stacy Duncan, the Executive Director of the agency from Broome County, New York, and CEO of Leadership Alliance, on how technology are being used to advance SDGs and reduce inequalities in urban communities. Stacy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Can you hear me all right and see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to Michelle and your team for inviting me to participate. It's a true honor to be part of this event. My thought for sequencing, I thought it was a nice sequencing, was to demonstrate where we are and give you a snapshot of our community, a small urban community. And we're at very much the infancy stage of this process, but why I think it's so important that cities like Binghamton become part of this initiative. And we also have the good fortune to work with Jim Donovan and ADEC and the Binghamton area. So it has been not just a professional, but a personal priority to look at how we aggregate our resources to have a more cohesive plan. So I wanted to first give you a snapshot of our community. We are pretty much a former Rust Belt community that used to focus, our urban industrial spine focused heavily on the manufacturing industry, like many I'm sure that you've worked with. But just to give you a sense of place of where Broome County or Binghamton, New York is, we are about 2.5 hours northwest of New York City, about equidistant from the city of Philadelphia. But essentially, what is of benefit from an economic development point of view in the traditional sense is that our location gives us access to a lot of large markets in the Northeast region of the United States. And so we have our economy, I would say, has grown slowly and transitioned out of an industrial base to a more knowledge and clean energy economy, but that time from us has been much slower than maybe other cities. Just to give you a history, I think it's helpful for background and context. We've had a rich and robust history of an industrial innovation presence, going back from the early 1900s, and we had more than 70 cigar factories, camera manufacturing. Two significant names for the Binghamton community was many years ago, the Endicott Johnson Shoe Factory. We have multiple legacy buildings here in the Binghamton area that are now being transitioned for adaptive reuse to things like housing, as well as our university has taken a number of those buildings and transitioned them to both a college of nursing and a pharmaceutical college where one of those legacy buildings used to sit. Our most, I guess our signature company was, we are the home of with the founding of International Business Machines, or IBM. At one point was a workforce of 30,000 or more that has been reduced down to about a presence of about 1,000. But we do have a number of global manufacturing companies in our region, such as Amphenol Aerospace, BAE Systems, and et cetera. So as I mentioned, and I want to point this out because we are one of those communities, like many, that have transitioned from your traditional production economy to a knowledge economy. But I don't know if that transition has been as seamless as it could, which is why this is of interest to me, specifically with advancing a global cities and perspective when it comes to advancing SDGs. Just a little bit on our emerging clean energy sector. Our bragging rights as Dr. Stanley Whittingham, who was a Nobel Prize awardee for the lithium-ion battery, has done his research here at Binghamton since the 1970s. We have some new constructions of Smart Energy Center of Excellence, a clean energy incubator in our downtown Binghamton location. We are an active participant in what is called the 76 West, and that's basically just the southern tier region of about 10 counties, a population just shy of 1 million people, where we partake in a clean energy competition, which invites companies really from throughout the world to locate in our region. And then the Huron campus, which was the former IBM, has now transitioned to essentially clean energy manufacturing. We have Charge for CV, which is a battery manufacturing company that is beginning operations, as well as some other solar manufacturing. So I point this out because I think our foundation and our history and innovation and now research and development has positioned us well to become a participant in these conversations. But as Carly pointed out, I think where we're lacking currently is the capacity or the cohesion of a plan of action with that. So as I noted too, our economy now has shifted to predominantly knowledge-based education and eds and meds, as we call it. And the traditional manufacturing and logistics plays still an important but a much smaller role. But the changing landscape and the impacts of COVID has created that digital divide, as we've seen. And what my next slides will point out is really that urban spine, that urban corridor, which used to be our industrial base, and the way we've grown over the years has created a lot of challenges and inequalities that I think we are poised to address through a solid plan. But as you see, like many cities, we are seeing a significant skill gap and education gaps, as well as increased food, housing, and transportation insecurity as a result of COVID. So about that urban industrial core, we are a small city. Our county population is only about 194,000 people. But as I mentioned, our historic base of industry, of commerce, of economic activity was in our industrial spine, which is actually the combination of the city of Binghamton and two smaller municipal villages, which make up about 80,000 people. So about just a little bit over 40% of our population does live in that urban core. Some demographic information, that is also where our highest percentage of poverty and that divide is also located too. As you see, we have a significant number of children who still live in or at or below the poverty level. Our per capita income and cost of living in that urban spine is high compared to the rest of our community, and that presents and results in a lot of stasis and stagnation for people to have any kind of economic mobility. I wanted to just show you visually what that looks like. So these three in the medium and darker blue is where the highest concentration of where we have occupied housing units, but no transportation available. And I'll talk a little bit more about using digital technology. We have a significant challenge with transportation to employment that I think we could utilize digital technologies to provide better access for individuals. a little bit there in those same populations in that urban spine here. You see our highest concentrations of poverty, but if you go further out to we still have pockets in our rural communities where we have a significant challenges as well with the transportation to employment. So I also wanted to just demonstrate it where that same overlapping of need lies with the percentage of individuals who are using some kind of public assistance to meet basic needs. So I think the more we look at how we utilize digital technology to improve the housing conditions, to improve transportation access, to employment, because there are a significant number of jobs available now in our community, but I'll talk a little bit about how our geography creates some challenges there. So I liked, as I talk about how I would like to see us use digital technology and hopefully build some capacity in the years ahead, is to build a framework of action that is centered around the use of digital technology, focusing on that urban core, but in our broader community. What I think that will better enable us to do by using digital technology is to provide access, education and training, transportation, improved housing conditions, which will translate to, I hope, more affordable housing options and lower cost for individuals. So a smaller percentage of their income will not be used on those essential needs, and as well as information, education, and then ultimately choice. We'd like to see economic mobility improve in our community. I've identified some of our key stakeholders that I would think would be part of the development of a plan for us, is our government and community institutions. When I say community, I'm thinking specifically a number of our nonprofits, but our philanthropic foundation, which has a significant presence in addressing need in our community. We have a very active private philanthropic community here that focuses in those same geographies, our urban core, to educate and communicate. I'm very interested in the voluntary local review process, is something I'd like to see us engage in here, to identify public and private partnerships, and to help identify and articulate the needs of the individuals in our community. Where I think organizations like mine and in partnerships with our planning departments is to help actually just create the capacity building that we need to do to prepare and implement and execute those programs, and also leverage our relationships outwardly to identify additional public financing tools or private investment as well. I'd like to see, I think the private sector here in our community, we do have a growing technology sector here, make investments in piloted programs or in training and apprenticeship programs to provide some of that access, as I noted before. And then finally, again, the civic engagement component, I think, has to be very critical to our development of a program to help share information. I did not use a map. I think I had a demographic info. What we found during COVID, like many communities, I'm sure, was a significant digital divide when it came to our education systems. About 25% of our urban population do not have access to computers or broadband or internet service. So that created a lot of challenges for our public school systems, who were remote, like we all were, and getting proper access to students, and that has created a significant educational divide and skills gap in our community. Some areas where I'd like to engage and like to educate on how we can better use digital economy tools for not just for advancing the SDG goals, but for improving the conditions, is using tools to improve our physical landscape, to use digital technology to improve the public safety in our communities, to address building efficiencies and improvements to help us monitor usage, especially in areas where the cost of energy and electricity is high compared to their income. To provide access, as I mentioned, a significant challenge for us is the transportation to work. As our community has grown, our large employers have moved further outside of the urban core, so that has created a significant challenge with providing transportation to work. But I know there are a number of digital platforms that we could engage in to provide sharing of services, sharing ride shares, better real-time information on public transportation that I don't think we're currently engaging in. And moving on to education and training, how do we continue to improve access for online classrooms and access to just basic service so that people can get the job training programs that might be available online. So we have a significant need to use digital tools to increase access in that regard. And then hopefully, the outcome of these efforts would be to provide economic mobility, increased wages, better health outcomes, and more choice for our communities. So I wanted to identify some potential next steps for a community like Binghamton, who, as I said, is really at the infancy stage of this. We would love to identify some public-private partnerships, groups like the Global CEO Alliance, to help us design to do that capacity building, to create a framework that we can measure on an annual basis, identify, because we are so early in this process, who are those like cities throughout the world that have gone through the process we're just embarking on, and share best practices and information to maintain sound metrics and measure if our goals are in alignment, or if our actions are in alignment with our efforts to advance SDG goals, and then continue to communicate locally and on our progress locally, nationally, and globally. So we're very excited at the opportunity to position Binghamton as a global city, and would look forward to gaining knowledge from my fellow panelists here and their experience, and many of the attendees who I'm sure could bring a lot to our community. So with that, I just want to thank you. There's some contact information, and just thank you for the opportunity to participate. And I look forward to hopefully coming back at some further point in time and talking about our progress in this regard. So thank you so much, Michelle and team.
Thank you so much, Stacy. And we're very happy to see that the identified next steps circle around collaborative action, data, sharing of best practice, and communication. And we would like to progress the discussion with you on how we can further cooperate through Global CEO Alliance and SDG cities. Thank you. And now I would like to call on our next panelist, Katya Schaefer, to share the UN Habitat work on technology and innovation related to people-centered smart cities through UNITEC. Katya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle. And I also would like to thank Carly, Andy, and Stacy actually for your inputs, because you really very nicely framed not only the challenges, but also the opportunities, in fact, that this whole discussion on sustainable urbanization outlines. And let me just maybe briefly summarize. I don't want to, repeat what you have said, but if we imagine the cities these days coming out or are still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the discussion of today, let's say digital transformation or internet connectivity, is no longer a luxury really, but instead it is really a cornerstone of building resilient communities. And I think keeping this in mind, I think, Stacy, you have very nicely actually outlined also the core of people living in cities and the opportunities actually as city leaders we must provide, in fact, to make cities the place where people actually can enjoy. And I also would like to not only say cities, but it's really the whole continuum from the rural to the urban and back, where actually people live. And I just want to add also to what Andy said on the environmental challenges, the climate change dimension. You know, this rapidly urbanizing world is in fact also showing ever more increasing inequalities. And I would say also migration is one of those phenomenons, and even the rapid onset of digital transformation that we are barely able to keep up with is really something that frames us. We are talking about innovation in cities, and I guess we should, maybe me saying here from a global perspective, not stop being ambitious in trying to address those challenges in order really to reach the last person on this planet. Let's say data, what was highlighted here, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, the issue of connectivity, skills, new digital economy, all these elements really shape our societies. And while those have actually the potential to serve people, at the same time, actually this digital divide that you highlighted remains. And in fact, such a, let's say, digital revolution must be really governed and directed in a democratic and very inclusive way. And in this regard, I think it was also highlighted by my previous speakers, it is really an opportunity to understand, you know, appropriate technology utilization in more innovative practices that we bring about to reduce such social gaps. And I don't want to really highlight here once more what is highlighted in the SDGs and the new urban agenda, but really digital transformation is more and more coming to the fore. And the definition of smart cities, as Carly was also saying, there's so many terms to it that it is very important to understand what does it actually mean. And that is here where I'm coming in from UN Habitat side. I'm leading, as much as David leads the SDG Cities program, I'm leading the People-Centered Smart Cities Initiative. And we are really trying to understand what digital transformation means in the context of urban localization of SDGs, of sustainable urbanization, and how we can actually improve living conditions for all. And in our, let's say, strategic plan, we have highlighted that there are some key areas that we should engage in addition to our ongoing activities. And here, I think the element of urban transformation, it's also a program I'm leading in UN Habitat, is key in really shaping cities as we need that. Digital transformation
项目就是去塑造
key programs we have, and data and the SDG Cities program really capturing all of that together in order to understand what is the evidence we need to take appropriate policy decisions towards, let's say, change on the ground that benefits people. And I would like to basically, in my contribution here, and I didn't prepare a PowerPoint, but I can share the speaking points with you, is really outlining what this so-called People-Centered Smart Cities program aims to do, how the United Nations Innovation Technology Accelerator that I'm leading as well can contribute to that, and then maybe also give you some examples that we are working on. So if I go back to our program on putting people at the center of digital transformation and sustainable urbanization, it is really for us to see how that digital transformation element makes cities work for the benefits for all, to drive sustainability, inclusivity, as well as prosperity, and in fact, under a very strong frame of human rights for let's say, the wider sphere of human settlements. We work actually quite closely with national local governments in trying to understand, in fact, what the digital transformation means to them. The concept of multi-level governance is here also quite important to bring all key stakeholders on board that are relevant in this really challenging journey, and really to help build the right skills and capacities, not only in fact to develop such technologies, but also to procure and to effectively use digital technologies in an ethical and inclusive way, as I said, and really not leaving anyone behind. We actually feel at UN Habitat side it's quite important that we play also a global advocacy role. What does that digital transformation, what do smart cities, people-centered smart cities mean, in order actually to ensure that the voices of the most unheard or unmapped people, not seen, marginalized groups, children, youth, older people, women, people in remote areas, and so on. I think the digital divide was mentioned many times here, how we can bring them into the decision-making, but also serve them. We have various partners. I might just want to mention the United for Smart and Sustainable Cities initiative that we have with the Information Technology Unit based in Geneva. We work with the Open and Agile and Open Smart Cities and the Cities for Digital Rights Coalition as some of those that help us really to carve out the digital human rights agenda here. The flagship program, in fact, engages very strongly on three key elements. Which looks at the overarching, not only global policy discussion, but really at national level, to bring that people-centered element in here. It is very important for us to really bring member states together to come up with one common denominator, as, let's say, many lessons can be learned from the global north. We also want to really bring those lessons learned in an appropriate manner to countries and cities in the global south. An element here we would like to look into as part of the program is also financing for digital urban innovation. So there are different kind of challenge-driven innovation approaches that we are setting out. Part of this is also the Climate Smart Cities initiative. We want to use also the understanding of, revenue sources on how to channel that to develop more developing countries, to smaller, medium-sized cities, but also to very grassroots urban communities to reach really to the last community member. And what we have very strongly understood is, while the principles are, the sense of those principles we are trying to promote and develop, is very much in the heart of people, but they lack really very often the capacity elements, or even to be empowered, let's say, digitally, to take the right decisions and steer processes forward. So for us, actually, we really believe, that the capacity of all levels of government to adopt such a people-centered approach, looking into actually privacy enhancing and rights preserving approaches to digital technologies for inclusion and sustainable urban development, is really one of the drivers for achieving SDGs. We have started actually to embrace a kind of a series of playbooks that are targeting local governments. And what the first one actually looks at really assessing the digital divide, to really help local governments to ask the right questions of what does it mean in my very context, and then really to derive with maybe the assistance and help of other partners to address such digital divides. One element I think, Stacey, you mentioned also is, of course, internet and broadband connectivity. The other one is access to digital devices, but I think the skill sets are not necessarily there in all contexts, and it's very important, in fact, in order to address such digital divide, that we really look comprehensively at that. It was also mentioned, I think, Carly, in the strategic development discussion, how to bring about digital technology and linking that with the spatial development drivers. We actually think that cities should have some sort of a digital transformation strategy. Cities have started doing that, and there is a lot of, let's say, wheels that have been reinvented, and we would like to really outline what are the key principles behind such digital transformation strategies, so that also they could inspire cities to ask a kind of right kind of questions. And then we also have a whole package that we would like to explore with our cities and partners, how we can roll out capacity development programs, not only on an individual level at cities, but also institutionally. We have seen that also in the big cities, in fact, by introducing a chief technology officer, that's not necessarily the solution, because it's really an inclusive let's say, institutional effort to make innovation happen. And maybe I would say the technology might at that point also be the cherry on the cake to conclude and make processes faster, maybe look at better evidence, and maybe even upscaling some of the approaches. And I would like to also just share with you what we are trying to do with our United Nations Innovation Technology Accelerator for Cities. Abbreviation is UNITAC. It's based in Hamburg, actually hosted in the Hafen City University by the City Science Lab. And in fact, they have developed with the city of Hamburg quite a few approaches that, of course, let's say, are very evidence-based, data at the center, and there's a lot to be learned. But we also must say Hamburg is not Lagos, Nigeria. So I think it's very important also to look at, what type of technologies are needed to take this forward. I captured actually in the previous presentation some of the elements where technology can help, not only to inform or generate information, or to help in reporting, or help in decision making, and having people engaging in those processes. Knowledge management are other areas, but I think we really want to develop a kind of a matrix that looks at what type of technologies are out there and which ones are needed. And I think, Stacey, thanks for really highlighting this element of the economic aspects, because they really drive sustainable development at local level and how people live in cities. And I think even the pandemic has shown us, maybe with addressing a digital divide and being differently, able to derive working environments, we might not have to commute so much. So I think even that layer in the map that you showed of linking communities to workplace commutes, might need to be adjusted if we look in a way that people might not necessarily have to travel that far anymore. So the Habitat leading, let's say, the UNITAC initiative here, we really would like to look at this urban innovation aspect and then only crown it with a technology element that is appropriate. And there are 3 key areas that we are trying to develop as well. Sorry for being always in the format of 3, but we really feel that it is very important to look, first of all, at open, transparent, and participatory governance of data and digital platforms. And I think that is a very strong link here to the work that David is leading on, let's say, data for understanding how SDGs can be localized. And we will work very closely together and really invite you all to be part of this, to see at what level data is needed. Do we need to understand trends, or do we really need to understand the depth of data? Do we have access to all the data? So that is a lot of questions that are coming up here. And the second element that UNITAC tries to understand is really mapping spatial analysis, data analytics, and visualization. If I may just give you an example of the vast percentage of people living in informal areas. I mean, how can we capture, in fact, their challenges that they are facing, and how can we translate this in at scale, really, to enhance people's living conditions and help them to thrive on the opportunities that potentially, cities and even digital transformation can provide. And the third key area is really piloting of people-centered smart cities and communities approaches in order to learn and really generate this kind of normative thinking that we can really, develop together with our constituencies to inspire actually the work across the globe. We have started, in fact, the program is just a year old, and we have started, in fact, engaging in a few let's say, quick win initiatives, to not only to explore how the team can respond to that, but also how we can actually serve cities. So one of the projects is actually based in Brazil, in the city of Alagoas, where we look at let's say, visual data storytelling, because it's also important to translate these Excel tables full of data into really visuals that everyone understands, and help cities to tell the story and actually engage people in addressing some, let's say, decision-making processes. Then we are also looking at a community called eThekwini in South Africa, where we actually look at mapping informal areas, all the dimensions from infrastructure, housing, the social elements, the economic drivers there, and really to better plan for prioritization of urban upgrading initiatives. There is also a key area of basically a lot of those neighborhoods are located in floodplains. So a key element here is also to better understand the urban resilience dimension. And then basically a lens is always, how can we go to scale and reach more communities based on these very comprehensive mapping that we are trying to do. We are also digitizing one of UN Habitat's tool that has been really manually analyzed, and I think technology allows us to actually go to scale by having machine learning mechanisms, and we are trying to basically set up an automated process for UN Habitat city resilience profiling tool so that we can reach from 20 cities to more cities, actually to better understand your resilience practices. One element, of course, here is the climate dimension, but we also look at the functionality of cities. What happens if your infrastructure collapses or even your ICT infrastructure collapses? So really having a comprehensive approach for that. And then just two more points before I conclude here is, what are the future areas of engagement that we also try to capture, because and that has not been mentioned here today in the previous conversations, is really what happens to cities that are in crisis or crisis in cities. How can this data assessment really help to understand towards building an urban recovery approach, while let's say linking from a humanitarian peace building angle to an urban recovery framework, and hence also contributing to SDG implementation. And then I think, Andy, that element of climate smart cities, climate adaptation is really key. And I think here looking also at appropriate technologies that help us better understand and driving a policy discourse in an inclusive manner, let's say. And I will put in the chat more information maybe on the flagship work, but also on UNITAC in particular. And, any ideas and suggestions are welcome, because it's really, we try with the UNITAC really to pilot initiatives that can be upscaled and that are really demand-based by communities, rather than serving and dishing out solutions like many of our private sector entities are doing, to really better serve the large urban challenges that we are facing. And thanks very much. I'm really grateful for being part of this panel, because I think it's a wonderful opportunity to bring all these issues to the fore, and the previous speakers have really confirmed many of the points that we are trying to address with a more structured approach by defining people-centered smart cities. Thanks a lot. And over to you, moderator.
Thank you so much, Katya. And we've seen that there are a lot of platforms and technology out there, but thank you for highlighting the role of innovation and technology and making sure that the use case are fit for purpose, inclusive, equitable, and help us move the needle towards the 2030 agenda. Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Leonard Fleck to speak about the own source revenue tool that will be part of the SDG City suite of tools and will soon be available for the cities to use. Over to you, Len.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. It's been really interesting listening to all the different contributions, and I want to try to share just some practical insights on a tool that we're developing at UN Habitat. I'm going to try to share my screen. Where is this thing? Here we go. Can you see this presentation?
Yes.
Great. So what I want to do is I want to talk about this tool and just give you a bit of a tangible feel of what it does. But before doing so, I just want to kind of motivate what this tool does and why what it does is important. So the tool tries to help local governments optimize their taxation and the revenues that they raise at the local level. And so we call that own source revenues, and I've just listed some of the more common ones. I'm sure you're all very much aware of and familiar with these, but just to make sure we're talking about the same thing. These local taxes, or OSR, is basically used all over the world. Here you just have a random sample of countries, and the extent to which the revenues of these local governments are made up of local taxes, as opposed to, transfers from higher levels of government, etc. So you can see that most countries are quite substantially rely on OSR. And there's a lot of good reason for this, because using OSR has several advantages. And I've just kind of positioned the four most important advantages, let's say, of OSR. They have a habit of, or they help increase the transparency and accountability of local government. Of course, if local governments request tax contributions from their citizens will in turn want to see improved services, more transparency on how local governments are spending the tax contributions that they've paid. So there's this virtuous cycle that can be kicked off through OSR. It's a stepping stone to enhancing creditworthiness, accessing loans. It provides local governments with more autonomy as opposed to, you know, transfers from higher levels of government that usually have certain earmarking requirements attached to them, or often do. And it can also be used as a regulatory tool to, for instance, incentivize more dense urban development through taxes on vacant land, etc. So there are a lot of benefits to using OSR. But now a lot of local governments, especially in developing countries, struggle to use local tax authority that has been devolved to them. There's not always a strong tax tradition at the local level, capacity sometimes missing, and there can be a degree of elite capture which undermines the ability of local governments to use this OSR capacity. Just as a kind of example, in Kenya, the estimates suggest that local governments are using only a fourth or raising only a fourth of what they could be raising in terms of taxation or OSR. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve with this tool. And in the past at UN Habitat, we've been working on this around the world, but I wanted to just talk to you quickly about one case in Kiambu County in Kenya, where we were able to optimize OSR and increase it by 100% between 2013 and 2014. And in doing this kind of work, we were thinking, okay, there really is a lot of potential here. This is something that we would want to scale up. But you know, we realized we can't do this type of work in Kiambu all over the world because we just don't have enough people at UN Habitat to do it. You know, there are thousands, millions of cities that could potentially benefit from this kind of technical advisory around how to optimize OSR. There are just not enough people. And even if there were enough people between UN Habitat and our partners, local governments wouldn't have the funding necessarily to pay for those services. It would be just too capital intensive, let's say, to provide these services all over the place. And another problem that we realized that we are facing is that oftentimes it's difficult to interpret the data that we do receive at the local level. And I've just kind of put some graphs here at the bottom, just an exemplary revenue. You can see it's somehow been increasing over time. But when you do, and let's say you go to a local government and you see that OSR has been increasing. Oh, sorry, I have to plug in some cable so my computer doesn't shut off. Should be good now. It's hard to know whether that increase is good or whether it's, I mean, clearly it's good, but is it good enough? What is the actual potential of OSR? Should it not be increasing even more rapidly? We just don't always know how to interpret data. So to solve all of these challenges, we thought, you know, we need some kind of scalable digital tool. And so that's what we've been developing for 3 years. And essentially, you can think of it working as one of these psychology tests that you may have done online, where the website would have various input fields and would prompt you to put in information about yourself. And then after you filled in various, responded to various questions, you would say submit, and then it would basically tell you what your personality profile is like. And so with OSR, we're trying to do the same thing. We have a series of questions that the local government, as the user, would be prompted to respond to. And upon submitting, there would be an automated analysis of the need for OSR reform, as well as what the particular challenges are that the local government is facing. Local governments usually know what their challenges are, but they still struggle to prioritize reform interventions because they may not know, of all these challenges that they are aware of, which ones are the most pressing, which ones are the binding constraints. So this tool tries to do that. And essentially it does, and I'll show it to you just now, but just for you to have a sense of how it works, is that any data that's input by the user, so by the local government, into the system, is automatically analyzed on the back end by the system in 3 different ways. So either we look at the history of, we can compare the data to the data from previous years, and we can say if there's, for instance, a decline, usually that would be a warning, a bad sign. So we could say, there's something there that's probably not right. We can also compare any data that we receive to peers. And we can, for instance, in this second graph here, we can compare, just for instance, if we have some data from Nairobi, we can compare it with similar cities or with similar GDP per capita and say, well, this is not this is not, doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but chances are if you're underperforming compared to your peers, that there's some room for improvement there. And we can also compare any data that we receive with global benchmarks. Sometimes there aren't global benchmarks for everything in the OSR system, so it's difficult to rely on this exclusively. But in some instances, we can say that a certain, that if you have, for instance, 100 revenue streams, that's probably too much. Probably you would want to use something like 5 revenue sources from which you get most of your revenue. So there are some benchmarks. I hope that was somehow comprehensive, and maybe as I throw up the website itself now, this will make a little bit more sense. So please allow me to just switch to the actual tool. I am not sure if you're now, okay, let me reshare just to be sure that you can see the website. I think I'll do it like this. Could I just confirm that you can see what's happening on my screen?
Yes, Lenny.
Great, thanks so much. So this is the landing page. Just as a disclaimer, we're still finalizing this tool. We're in a testing stage, we're still finding bugs, so we haven't released it. It's not yet with local governments for usage, but we are almost there. So I think showing you a little bit of how this works will give you a better feel. This is the landing page. It just gives information about how the tool works, why OSR is important, essentially what I've taken you through until now. Then there's a login function. Just refresh this. There's a login function, but I'll just skip it. Usually the local government would need to create a user profile. Then they can select the last year, financial year, for which they'll be inputting information. They can select their country. I'll just put Kenya for purposes of this demo. You can select the currency. I'm just gonna go into Nairobi because I've input some data on that already. And then you can see there's various now input masks, which basically request some information, usually financial information, but also socio-demographic information. And there are these various tabs across the top. So these are all tabs for local governments to input. They're quite extensive, and we're trying to minimize the extent of information that the user would have to input so that they don't get turned off by the amount of data that we're asking them to provide. But essentially, they go through these steps, each time inputting the data. And then once they've done that, there is this automated analysis. And it's split into these 2 components where it tells them, this is your reform need. So for instance, here, based on the data I've input, the reform need is a total of 0.6 out of 3, where 3 would be like you don't need reform, and 0 is you need reform. So this would be, in this particular case, this country, this city would really need reform. And it's important to do this first step because we don't want cities to just do OSR reform for the sake of it. We want them to first understand that there may be a need for OSR reform based on the resource requirements, based on their access to other sources of funding, based on the accountability and efficiency of their expenditure. So this is how we determine whether there is a need for reform. And there's these kind of automated interpretations, and it says, reform is needed. And then there's this detailed analysis, which now will break down for the user. Okay, why are we saying that it's needed? What is the analysis that's done? And this is just, everything is populated automatically. All these takeaways are automatically generated. The key metrics are automatically generated. Oh, sorry, just move me forward. And so the user can now understand, okay, why are we trying to tell them that they need to do something about their OSR? The more interesting analysis is, of course, not just that whether they need it or not, but what's going on, what do they need to do to improve it? What does the diagnosis say? And in terms of diagnosis, we look at it from 2 different perspectives. We look at the different processes within revenue systems. We look at, is it a problem of registration? Are people just not even accounted for in the systems? Are people exempt from paying taxes? Are they not even being billed? What is the problem? You don't just, you of course want to tackle the problems that are causing the biggest gap within your revenue system. So this is now where we start telling the user, the local government, look, really, you don't have a collection problem. Based on the data you've input, it really looks to us as though you have a billing problem. Focus on notifying your taxpayers about their tax obligations rather than other things. And of course, all the data is automatically generated. It kind of informs the user. It explains what the gaps are, how much is lost for these different aspects of the process. And it kind of tells them, look, this is your key problem. It also then goes to a series of potential problems. And it says, in addition to looking at it from a process perspective, can we say that there's an issue with individual taxes, with individual revenue sources? Is there an issue of having too many OSR streams, etc.? And here there's actually a whole series of other things that we'll test for, which are not yet programmed on this website. And
Lenny, I think we're already running out of time. Maybe we can share some briefer of the ROSRA tool to the participants.
Yes, if you just allow me to take 30 seconds, is that fine? I'm basically wrapping up. So this problem diagnosis that I was telling you about, of course, also has a detailed breakdown, which is here, which now it takes the user through what are they actually generating, how much could they be generating, and a whole lot of analysis that is everything, is automatically generated. And this is instant. As people can go back, they can change data. And as they change things here, they save it. It will automatically change the analysis and what's going on this summary tabs that I've just showcased to you. So thanks so much for your time. I hope this was somehow informative and gave you a sense of what we're trying to do with this tool. And hopefully we'll be able to share the actual tool with you so that maybe you and your partners in local governments can start tinkering with it and seeing whether they can actually use it, not just for analysis, but really to inform decision-making around how to optimize their revenue systems. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leonard, for giving us an overview of the ROSRA tool. I'm sure a lot of the audience would like to know more about that. And if you can give us permission, we'll post your email address, or maybe the audience can coordinate through us if they want to know more about the ROSRA tool. Okay, and moving on to the last segment, this will be very quick. We prepared a short video about the governance tool that will be part of the SDG City suite of tools. It will be under review and it will be launched very, very soon. So if you can allow us to conclude the session with the video, maybe we can share that to the audience now. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, to our panelists, DIFED and team. I'm afraid we don't have any more room for Q&A, but please do send us an email. And I hope everyone had a very engaging discussion today. And please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Thank you all speakers, and thanks for giving up your Sundays. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Devin.
Bye.